actually. I'm the administrator. Maria is your coordinator. Karen and Greg are our hospitality. Carrie is our mission coordinator. And then we have Richard Knight, who's our prayer coordinator. And those are some of the basic items. I'm also a deacon, so I'm assigned to this class, and they're actually looking for other deacons that can fill in. So there's at least like a 10 person or 10 family to 1 ratio whenever it comes to deacons. So I'm going to try to get a little bit more into depth about those items that we're going to need. And again, it's going to be important as we start this new year. We talk about when we're going to do social events or what types of events we like to do, what other types of mission support we like to do, those types of items. So I really anticipated that this would be a day of not that much participation because everybody's coming off a summer break, but this is a good turnout here today. Other than that, I mean, we have our first fruits that obviously, if you guys remember today, first fruits is the first Sunday of every month, and bring in your canned goods or box goods or non-perishable. And then the announcements that had gone out during the week from dbc.org, you know, we're really looking for some nursery help. There's new programs that are starting. They have not announced yet about the men's ministry, but I can tell you that's something I've heard about for months now, and they're saying August 27th is a Sunday afternoon, and they're going to have a barbecue that will go over a lot of different men's ministry items that are going to come up. The Friday morning men's huddle, the Sunday night men's fraternity. There's different types of programs with the Naomi ministry to help widows and single parents. And then a new program coming out for disaster relief that really is coming together. So those types of items will be big coming up on the 27th. And really that's about the big ticket items for right now. I'm going to ask again next week that we have a little bit more of a summary of who our leadership team is and here in the class. You did see that email that went out about the leadership conference. I don't know if Bo talked about it briefly, but he is trying to get those types of leaders and the deacons to meet on a regular basis to go over a consistent format of training, and that's what's coming up next Saturday. I'm trying to think. That's about it, guys. So really just getting back into where we are with Sebastian and the Trinity, the study of the Trinity, kind of where our plans are for the rest of the semester. Like always, I think we need to share what our prayer requests are. I have 3 that I'd like to keep on everybody's heart from a personal viewpoint. My nephew, if you guys recall over the summer, my nephew died of heroin overdose up in Pittsburgh. My sister's birthday is today, so already she's lamenting the idea that, again, as much as you celebrate your birthday, you immediately remember what your losses are. So that's been one. Another that is a friend of mine who lost a son actually a year ago today and has become a very big advocate for underage driving or drinking and driving. His son died about 2 o'clock in the morning in Richmond, Virginia. He was drinking and driving when he was supposed to be at home getting ready for football practice. And so that death is now a year anniversary. And then lastly, to this class, Vic Botha is a man from South Africa that has attended this class pretty often, and that we would consider him a member. His mother-in-law is actually dying of cancer right now in South Africa. So his wife, and I believe he may be over there as well, that are kind of in the last bits of her life.
He was in the choir.
Was he here today?
He was here this morning.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I know she's been battling it for a while, and the other connection is that Stefan Els was the guy in his 40s that had passed away a year and a half ago. Stefan and Jocelyn have been members off and on. They've not been in this class, obviously, but there's a connection back into this class, into that family, and we'd love to keep them in our prayers. Are there any?
I think you're talking about people passing away.
Yeah.
The grief share program starts up August 29th. It's in this room and then it's next room. It's a great program. Everyone goes through various stages of grief. It's all different. But just having other people sitting around you, got serious losses. Sometimes it's going to feel like you're going crazy. Do it all. It's nice to have talk to people and know what you're talking going through. Sometimes people will ask, you don't know how to explain that to these people all. It's a good support group. Irene Strokes leads that group. August 29th is starting up, I think it's June 7th, 6:30 or 7, something advertising that. And then the perspectives classes on the 20th, 6 to 9 p.m. The first, it's a 15-week course, it's $250 or something like that. They got discounts. The first night to let anyone attend, just check it out. You want to check it out about missions around the world, the heart of God, what you're doing.
I hear it's a great program. I hear so far they haven't had a lot of people sign up, so if you're thinking about it, now's the time.
Well, those are the types of things that I would like to make sure that we do cover in more detail next week as we get, most of our membership back. The other programs like Celebrate Recovery, some of the other items that are here at the church, I'd like to just make sure that we continue to promote, because there's a lot of items around here that can help us out individually, or being able to share that with either other church members or people in the community that would again bring them back into what our mission statement here is really showing. We show
A lot of
Jesus.
them are in the bulletin today.
Excellent. Yeah, it's that time of year, right, guys, where we're all coming back together. So, are there any other prayer requests you have? Well, I'll pray us in and then let's get started. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day, and thank you for this group of people and the opportunity to come together. We so much love and appreciate the freedoms that we enjoy. Sometimes we take them for granted. Please help us, and please constantly remind us about what we have and the blessings you bestowed on us. We know there's people that have lost loved ones or that have dealt with health issues. We only ask for your continued love and grace towards us. Put your arms around those in pain, lift them up, and again, let us always shine towards you. We ask this in your name, amen.
Amen. All right, welcome back, guys. Glad to see you all. I'm glad y'all are here so that I can say, great job, Karen. I enjoyed the class a lot, learned a lot, good food for thought. Nicely done. It's always important to think about the kinds of things that she was talking about, because we need to discern God's will for all things in all situations. And it's good to realize that maybe things aren't always the way we think they are when we're buying stuff off the shelves. Perhaps we don't need to have as much confidence in our good old government and others. So it's good to pay attention. It's that time of year where I plan to delete all the prayer requests that I have, that I've been praying over for you guys, and start a new one. I think we'll do a different format this year. I don't know, maybe I'll send out emails to you guys, and then y'all can email me your prayer requests. I don't want to put any work on anyone to have something written going around and someone's got to tabulate it and all that. So I think that's what I'll try next. You're welcome to always call me, text me, or email me. But if you get an email from me saying share your prayer requests if you like, do that. And then I think periodically I'll share them all with the class if you want me to. Or if you say it's confidential, that's fine. No problem.
Well, can I, you did mention about prayer requests, and we're going to see our daughter this afternoon, and we have to show her something she got from court, and our daughter was hurt by her ex-boyfriend who beat her up. And so the trial date is set for September 15th. She doesn't really want to deal with it, but she knows she has to deal with it. So just prayers for a calm heart for her, and that she can just hang with it and hang through this whole process. And so we're just trying to help her through it. So.
Okay. Anybody else? You can say them now. They are being recorded for those of you who aren't always with us. So if it's confidential and you don't want it recorded, don't say it. But if you have one now, that'll be fine, and I'll come back later and listen to the recording and write them down if you'd like. Okay. Those of you who haven't been with us, we have been studying the Trinity for a while. We started out with God as one. What does that mean to say He is one? One being, one essence. We then moved on to say what it means to have God as three persons. And how does that relate? And how do you have one being who's three persons? Because frankly, we can't really relate to that well. We can look around in nature and try to see some allegories and some analogies and things like that, but as you sit here and think about it, you say, I'm one being and I am one person. How could I be one being and three persons? But lo and behold, that's God. And people have been debating that up until now for thousands of years. It's the best formulation we have. I believe it to be true. But you can understand why it would take some folks some time to get to that. It took me some time to get to that. I'm like, that's crazy. I don't know what you're talking about. And as you start putting all the scriptures together, eventually you say, I don't know what else it could be. And then you just arrive at by the process of elimination sometimes. So we study the doctrine of the Father. Right now we're in the doctrine of the Son. The formal title for that would be Christology, the doctrine of the Christ. We've been talking about isms. Isms are names for doctrines and theologies. We talked a little bit about adoptionism and Apollinarianism, and we're going to talk today about Nestorianism. So I'm saying that there are 6 main isms when it comes to the doctrine of the Son. 6 major heresies that have evolved over the centuries that either have denied Christ's full divinity, or have denied his full humanity, or have denied the unity of the two. And what I read says, if you can get your mind wrapped around those 6 major isms, everything else you hear is just a variation on those things. So if you kind of get an idea of what Apollinarianism is, and forgive me, I can't say, I read it, but I don't say it a lot, so it doesn't come out right. Once you get your idea around what that says and how to refute it, when you start hearing things today on the radio or on TV, they won't say this is what Apollinaria says, right? They don't have any idea. But when they say things, you say, yeah, but let me tell you what that's based on that maybe isn't so right. Let me tell you what that leads to, because you've already considered the doctrine. So a couple of weeks to finish the isms. I don't know that we'll be in Christology too much longer. Then a couple of weeks on his 3 offices. We've talked about how Christ was priest, prophet, and king. And as we're talking about the Trinity, we said we were going to talk about what is peculiar or particular to each person in the Trinity. What does that person do, which is what distinguishes him from the other of the Trinity. For Christ, that would be what we would talk about, priest, prophet, and king. So that may take a couple of weeks, 2 weeks. After that, we plan to start the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. Pneumatology is the official title for that. Pneuma is how they pronounce it. Hey, come on in. Pneuma is how they pronounce it nowadays. Pneuma means spirit or breath or wind. It means a lot of things, and that's what applies to the Holy Spirit, because he is God's spirit or breath or wind. Once we're done with all this, planning to do a study on Jesus' parables. So we'll get to that, I guess, 2-3 months, I think. So, focusing on what we were doing more on Christology, as I mentioned a while ago, Christology boils down to Christ being fully divine, fully human, both natures united in one person, and fully God-man eternally. And that's interesting. I don't know how much we're going to get into that, because as I've done the research on it, there's really not as much there as I thought there was as to Christ now being in the flesh and human eternally. Is he? We'll talk about it. I think the answer is yes, based on some, but there's no verse that directly addresses it and says that. We have to sort of draw implications from what verses are there, which means I don't know how dogmatic we can be about it. But anyway, we've done 1 and 2, so today we're going to do 3. We talked about last time, whenever that was, eons ago, docetism. Remember one of the 6 isms? Docetism. Jesus only appeared. The word in Greek for to appear is dokeo. That's where we get the word docetism. He only appeared human. So this is the theology that he wasn't actually human. He was fully divine. He looked human to us for reasons known only to God, but he wasn't. And of course, if you say things like, but the Bible says he was human, you already discern a problem with this theory, because that would mean the Bible was wrong or whatever. So it was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. We'll cover that in a couple of weeks. We talked for a minute about philosophy. For those of you who don't know, my bachelor's degree is in philosophy. I cannot stand the stuff. I can tell you that now. Basically because I'm not smart enough for it. As you sit there, it is not easy to do and understand, and it takes a lot of energy for me. You read some of these great foundational texts, and it may take many, many readings to even begin to understand what these people are saying. And by then, I would usually run out of energy and no longer had the strength to then begin evaluating it. So I'd be like, okay, this is what Plato said, I think. And I no longer know if this is true or not, and I no longer care. It is time to read something else. So that's why I don't. All right. But it's like everything else in the world. It's wonderful, but only to the extent that it increases love and devotion to Christ. Period. That is true for everything. That is true for philosophy. If it causes you to grow in your love for Christ and your understanding of him and your devotion, it's fabulous. Whatever it is. If it causes you to turn aside from his path, to think less of him, to think more of someone or something else, to have devotion for anyone or anything else, I don't care what it is, it's bad. That applies to philosophy as well. Any more or less than that, frankly, is sin, according to what the Bible says. Anything not done in faith is sin. All right, so we talked about denying Christ's humanity. Why is that a problem? What's wrong with that? Well, because the crucifixion and the atoning death and our salvation depends entirely on him having been human. We talked about the verse in Hebrews which said Christ had to be made like us in order to pay the price for our sins. So if you deny his humanity, first of all, you just made the Bible a lie. because he wasn't made like us, even though the Bible says he was made like us. That's already a problem. But next, you just lost one of the main pillars for the theory of the atonement that we take, which is God was fully human so that human sins could rest on him. Because how will human sins rest on deity? We don't really understand that concept, but on a human we get. And because we're also sinful. Christ had to be made like us. So then we talked about Apollinarianism. Christ only had a human body, the rest was fully divine. That's Docetism light. In other words, Docetism said he wasn't human at all. Apollinarius said, well, okay, he had a human body. Everything else was purely divine. Ultimately, they really fall to the same criticisms, because ultimately we said things like, if Christ didn't have a human mind and human emotions and human spirit, Christ died to save all of us. He didn't just die to save our bodies. So when he died to save all of us, he had to be human like all of us. He had to be made like us. So ultimately, this is not all that different from Docetism. It's just a variation. And again, the Bible states too many times, directly and indirectly, that Jesus was fully human. I mean, it says so. And then it illustrates it time and time again. So you are basically going to need to take some scissors and cut like the Gospels out and cut several of Paul's epistles out and just rewrite the Bible, which people have done. Don't get me wrong. But so today, let's begin our study on Christ having two natures, two distinct and full natures. Come on, David. United in one person. Now, according to Erickson, who is one of the systematic theologies we're reading, this is one of the hardest things there is to understand. So you can't really blame folks for struggling with this question. It is one of the most difficult of all theological problems, ranking with the Trinity itself, with the whole free will divine sovereignty. Also comes Christ's fully God and fully human nature. Why? Well, because we talk about it by definition, you're one or the other. You're either infinite or you're finite. You're either omniscient or you're not. You can be omnipresent or you can't. And we as humans are no on all those things, and God is yes on all the things. How do you get the infinite and the finite together in one person? It really, frankly, if you're going to be honest, it's extremely hard to understand, and it's hard to explain, which is why ultimately we say, it just is. Ultimately, that's what we say. That's not what you say?
No.
Oh, okay. I just saw you like, no, that's not what I say.
No. But is God only fully human through Jesus Christ?
I think so, but that's an excellent question. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I mean, it says in John that the Word was made flesh
Yes.
and dwelt among us.
Amen.
And it also says, even back in the Old Testament, I think in Isaiah, that he would be one of the women. And, I mean, it begs the question, what do you do with Mary? I mean, why would you even need Mary if, Christ could have just come down?
Here.
I hear, what's the word again in the Old Testament when the pre-incarnate Christ appeared to people?
I don't know.
And sometimes they'll say it's an angel, but you
Yes.
can tell by the attributes.
Then it's gotta be Christ.
Jesus.
Pre-incarnate.
A theophany or
Oh, yes.
something like that.
Theophany,
Yeah.
yes. That's a God appearance.
Yeah, and so, I mean, what would be the point? If he had come down before, he could come down again. He wouldn't need to have been born of a woman.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with that. But one question that I have then is, and I'm not saying that this is not true, but if God never changes, how could Christ be eternal and not in the flesh for a time, and then eternal and in the flesh for the rest of the time? And I'm not saying that he didn't do that. It's just one of the things I'm like, I don't know how to get my mind wrapped around that, but that's what happened. And I'm not denying that. That's the kind of thing that I think about in the dark reaches of the night. This question is extremely important because of the implications for all first order issues. Remember we talked about once upon a time, there's sort of this hierarchy that folks who are spending a lot of time thinking about this stuff talk about. They say first order issues is things you do not compromise on.
Non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable, okay? If someone does not agree on these first order things, you be careful how you interact with them, you be careful what kind of relationship you have with them, because they're very far different from you. So it will be things like what God's nature is like, what's his relationship to people, Christ's divinity and humanity are first order issues. Because anyone who says Christ wasn't fully human or wasn't fully divine has just changed the nature of God in a way that means that there's very little else that's going to look the same in their practice and in their life and their faith. So this is one of those because of what we said. How's our salvation come to pass if he's not fully divine and fully human? How are we saved? We don't know. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. Sometimes it's not the doctrine that's the problem, it's the implications that cause problems. Now, as for this particular issue, the Bible says very little about how the natures relate. According to others, we have to carefully examine Scripture, we know that, and history's laboratory to understand better. In other words, what have people said about it in the past, and what have been the responses? And as we look through those over time, perhaps we can begin to understand the doctrine better. And then we have to accept it on faith unless and until God decides to reveal it more clearly. So, Nestorianism. Once again, this is named after a guy. Nestorius was a very eloquent bishop of Constantinople, seat of the later Greek church. In other words, it started in Rome, way back when, around 100, 300, 400. After a while, everything political and religious shifts east to the Greek-speaking church, starting when Constantine makes Constantinople the seat of the Roman Empire. So Roman Empire becomes the Constantinople Empire, basically, but it's still a continuation of the Roman Empire. He was a vigorous apologist. I like that word because, like many people, when you first heard about Christian apologists, you think that's someone apologizing for the faith, like, I'm sorry I'm a Christian and I'm sorry for what we believe. It's not what it means, actually. A formal word, apologia, a word toward. An apologist is someone who makes a formal defense, who sets out the doctrines and explains them and refutes things that go against them. So he was a vigorous apologist, including taking military action, because back in those days, if someone didn't agree with your theology, you might end up taking some soldiers over there and hashing it out. He even had an Arian temple destroyed. In other words, he was so against what they had to say that he took some troops over there and he destroyed it. He was a prolific writer. We have lost much of that over time. It's hard to evaluate Nestorianism because it's lost somewhat in the midst of time. But like the other six isms, the dispute was entangled with intense political rivalries. In other words, you couldn't always tell whether the church was against Nestorius because they actually didn't like his theology or because they were trying to get political advantages. More followers meant more money and more troops and more influence, or not. So it's a little bit hard to unravel that sometimes. Remember what they say, our First Amendment does not protect government from religion, it protects religion from government. And that's what we see here. We see that as soon as government co-ops religion, lots of awful things tend to follow. So Nestorius, actually, funny enough, probably wasn't a Nestorian. His followers were. In other words, he probably started saying things that didn't sound right, may not have fully ascribed to what later became the doctrine with his name on it, but as people came after him, they started fleshing out what he believed, and eventually they became Nestorians, even if Nestorius actually wasn't. That's not an uncommon accusation. People will tell you that John Calvin is not really a Calvinist. Martin Luther was not really a Lutheran like we know them today. That whatever they said back in the past, after the hundreds of years have come, Calvinism no longer looks exactly like what John Calvin said. Lutheranism no longer looks like what Luther actually said. And in fact, even folks will say that about Jesus. There is reputed the fact that Gandhi said, I love your Christ, but I dislike your Christianity. In other words, I love where it started, but I don't like where it ended up. So for Nestorius, that seems to be the case. He started something that then went another way. Politics probably resulted in him being condemned for views he did not actually have. In other words, he might have said something and someone grabbed a hold of that and sort of twisted it into what he didn't actually say, and then that kind of grew big. We see this in politics all the time. It's human. It happened all the way back then. And eventually the church condemned him for things he didn't quite say, but like I said, his followers later did clearly and explicitly state it. So around 428, Nestorius had to judge whether calling Mary Theotokos, which means God-bearing. If we're going to describe her by an official church doctrine, what names do we give her to describe her role and her function and her being? He had to think about Theotokos, God-bearing. He wanted to include the term anthropodikos, which means human-bearing, which, as far as we're concerned, is about right. Yes? She was God-bearing and human-bearing. She bore the God-man. Right? Problem was, he may have misspoken in ways that made it sound like he was rejecting God-bearing outright. Why? He said things like a human can't bear God and Mary was just a vehicle. We've already talked about that in other doctrines. So it sounds like he's denying a very fundamental truth about Christ. He seemed to think that if all we say is that Mary is God-bearing, then either we're implying Arianism, which we studied, Jesus is a created being, or Apollinarianism, which is Jesus not fully human. Now, the person who came against them most was a guy by the name of Cyril, who was a staunch political rival. Cyril wanted his position, he wanted Cyril's position. They were fighting over who would get to be the bishop. Ultimately, the church decided he was an adoptionist. What's that? We studied that in the past. Jesus was a mere man who God made divine when he adopted him as son. Some people say adoption happened when Christ was born. Christ was just human until the day he was born, and then God said, now you're also divine. Or at the baptism, when the Spirit of the Lord descended on him like a dove, they say he was totally human until that moment, and then God imbued him with divinity. Or some say at the crucifixion. So ultimately they decided that's what Nestorius was. Later followers were more explicit in regard to the separation. They say Christ was two separate persons, one human and divine. They say Christ's human nature was complete and the Word possessed him at the incarnation. So that's where they drew the adoption, at the incarnation, which is when he was born. They say it was a junction, not a union. Now sometimes you feel like, I don't know what the difference is, frankly. Here's the response. It's a hazy doctrine. That's why it kind of seems like it's kind of going all over the place, because it was kind of going all over the place. I don't know that it was ever really unified. The Bible doesn't say much about it, so we don't need to belabor it too much. But Jesus never referred to himself as we. He referred to himself as I. The Bible never refers to Jesus as they or them. It's always singular. He has no duality statements about himself. He never calls himself we, compared to the Trinity, which does, we believe, say we. Let us make man in our image. Let us go down there and confuse them. Jesus never said,
I and the Father are one.
Yeah, I and the Father are one, and that's
Singular.
one. That's one, right? It's not
Yeah.
we and the Father are three or something like that. Although he probably said that. Yes?
Are there any groups today that follow this?
I haven't seen, yes. We'll get to that in a second.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry.
I think so. We have interior conversations of Trinity addressing each other, like we said. Jesus praying to the Father. Father saying, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. So you see two. Jesus never says that about himself.
You could also, you could sort of, the testimony of the enemy, you could take the several occasions where when Christ drives out the demons, he says, early on he says, you know who I am,
Correct.
but you're not allowed to say who I am. And they say, we know who you are.
You are the Son of God.
Yeah, and the demons will talk about, well, you're God wearing this jacket or something like that. And the same thing when the Pharisees and the others are talking about who is this man who goes about driving out demons, they even in the counter argument say, this isn't a man who's claiming to have this sort of secondary divine nature. They're sort of in the argument, making the argument.
Well, he also says, tell them I am. You know, before Abraham was, I am, which is the name in the Old Testament for God the Father. I am. So, I mean, there's so many verses, and in Colossians, I mean, you know, and I'm having a senior moment.
That's all right.
More and more of those. It's really scary. But you know, in him dwelt the fullness of the Godhead bodily.
That's right. I mean,
You know,
sometimes you want to take these people and reach back 1,000 years and be like, I mean, in him dwelt the Godhead in bodily form. How are you denying his humanity?
Yeah.
I mean, how are you even doing this? And people still do it. In answer to your question, we're going to get eventually in the next week or two, probably not today, to the creed at Chalcedon, which was written specifically to refute a number of these. And not all the churches ascribe to it. Some of them said, no, we don't believe that about Jesus. So we'll see when we get there. It's like some Eastern Orthodox and some Ethiopian church and things like that. I don't remember. There's a list coming.
It just always perplexed me about Paul writes that he set aside his godliness, chose to be amongst men. And then the Bible doesn't fill a lot of gaps. From the time he was about 12 years old, and he said he was back in Jerusalem, and he told his parents, you knew I should have been in my father's house, or something along those lines. But up until the time he starts his mission and his work at 30, there's a big gap there. So it's that idea, he's setting aside his godliness to be man, or to learn, or to take on all the pain of man has always been perplexing. And there's really nothing that fills in those gaps.
That's right. There are people who have tried to write gap fillers.
Right.
So we hear things like the Gospel of Thomas and these other stuff that folks have said that's not right. There have been some fascinating stories about Jesus trying to fill in those gaps. I mean, I think the Gospel of Thomas said he made 12 birds out of clay and then breathed life into them and they flew away. And that one actually is in the Quran as true. So there's been a lot of effort, but we don't believe that. We think that the Bible, and we sometimes speculate on why, and our only answer is because God said we didn't need it. But if you are going to be honest, you have to be honest and say, we can't understand a lot of this stuff. We wrestle with it. We want to understand it because by wrestling with it, we grow more like Christ, more in His image. We understand Him better. We should hopefully love Him more. But we just can't at some point explain it. But as we said, how do we know? Christ was one person, one man. Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us, not there. Ephesians kind of brings this together. It's a slightly different context, but look, for He Himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. Now, he's talking about Gentiles and Jews. He's not talking about human and divine. But you sure could fill those words in here, and they probably would work just as well. And it says He Himself, not they themselves. By abolishing in His flesh, don't say He doesn't have flesh, and don't say He's plural, the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in Himself He might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. Again, we're talking about a lot of things He's drawn together. The initial discussion began on Jews and Gentiles, but it sure does. I sure would apply this to human and divine as well. I sure would. And might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross by having put to death the enmity. He broke down the barrier, making two into one. He made them into one new man. There it is for you. One man. Answers lots of questions right there. And He reconciled two into one in His body on the cross. Same logic applies. And by the way, Jesus is referred to as He like every time they refer to Jesus today. All right, but here's the question for you. Let's ponder this one for a minute. What about where Jesus refers to Himself in the third person? He says, the Son of Man. Is that perhaps a duality statement? Some people will spin a theory to say Jesus is one thing and the Son of Man is another, because you will see the Son of Man come in His glory. That's what Jesus said. Jesus, that's what they say. For example, but so you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He's referring to Himself. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life a ransom for many. Now, the fact that Jesus said the Son of Man came to give His life as a ransom for many, and then went and died on the cross, seems like it answers the question that He was talking about Himself. But some people want to try to push the extremes on that one. The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay His head. When the Son of Man comes in His glory and all the angels with Him, then He will sit on His glorious throne. He refers to Himself roughly 78 times this way, according to what I read. And even though when you first hear that, you say, I don't know, wait, maybe. I mean, He does refer to Himself in third person. Maybe He's two people or something. But since He's prophesying these things about Himself and then in many cases fulfilled them, He's clearly talking about Himself. It's a messianic title that comes from Daniel 7. And unlikely as it seems, though, some people do try to use it to argue that He was two people. Yes?
Okay, well, and He was flesh and blood.
Yes.
In Revelation, it says, to Him who loved us and washed us from our sins in His own blood, and has made us kings and priests to God. And then it says, to His God and Father, to Him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah, well, we know His side was pierced, and out came blood and water.
Which is what would come out of a human being under those circumstances.
Yeah, I think I told y'all once I was trying one time to witness to a Jehovah's Witness, and I don't remember, this is like 10 years ago, 10 years ago, and he was saying things about the Bible and things, and I'd say, yeah, but what if the Bible says that directly refutes that? And his answer was, well, the Bible doesn't always say things that actually happen. It speaks in lots of parables and allegories. So everything that went against what they had to say was a parable or an allegory.
Well, and you have to realize they don't even use a real translation of the Bible.
Right.
They use the quote-unquote New World Translation, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was a God.
That's right.
So,
It's hard though, because he was a janitor, but he was one of the most educated religious people I've ever met. He had an answer for everything. Anytime he said something, he said, "This is our doctrine," and he could list 3 or 4 places in the Bible to support that, more or less, kind of, at least in his mind. And if I said, "But what about?" he typically had an answer for that too. He's a janitor.
But it was his Bible, not.
Correct. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying I'm going to step back and give him the respect to say the man knew his religion very well. He's wrong in like every respect, but he knew it very well. And that's
Apologetically, he was
one heck of an apologist for a Hispanic janitor. He was awesome.
And I think part of that, though, that the whole argument kind of shades into Gnosticism, which is the sort of the corruption of the physical, and that ultimately it's the spiritual that is divine and great. And that in order to sort of achieve anything of merit, we have to sort of throw off the physical piece in the Gnostic point of view. But that type of thing and what your janitor friend was talking about, that flies in the face if you go all the way back to Genesis. God is creating, and God says this creation is good. And so when God says the physical, the creation, all this stuff is good, then there has to be some way after the fall to reconcile all of creation, that's the physical as well as the spiritual, back to the original goodness from whence it came. And so all of this, when the Son of Man comes back, when the physical body returns, all of that will be sort of re-glorified.
Amen.
And we have to realize what he's given us just so far, and what we'll have, peace. Peace that passes understanding. And it doesn't say that that's something we'll just have at some future time in a different place. It said, right now, it says he's our peace who's broken down the wall of partition between us. I know you're trying to get to this, but when Rebecca was born, my life was in real danger. I had more stuff pumped in me than you can imagine. But I had prayed so hard while I was I was actually in the hospital before I went into labor with her, and I can tell you, I felt peace. It's like I've never felt it just like this before, because they kept trying to tell me, I might have a stroke, and I felt peace. It was like it was on me. It was like in the room. It was like inside me. I was in a lot of pain, but it was like something solid, like cotton or something, that I could reach out and pull pieces off of, is how strong it was. So, he's given us so many things right now.
Amen. And let me clarify one thing. When I identify that janitor as Hispanic, it is not because his ethnicity is an issue, it's because English was not his first language. So this guy who doesn't even speak English as a first language, who is a janitor, was on it. Everything I had to say, he had an answer. That was very impressive. All right, and thank you for that testimony. That's beautiful. I just wanted to say that before I forgot. Like as it seems, people use this to argue that Jesus and the Son of Man are 2 distinct persons instead of one person with 2 names. All right, so we're going to go through these a little on the quick side because they are variations on a theme. Monophysitism. Mono means one. Physis means nature. It's where we get physics, physicians, people who deal with the nature of things. Also known as Eutychianism, because of the guy named Eutychus who started with it. Jesus had only one nature. And the brief history on this was the Nestorianism eventually got defeated. And by the way, as silly as it sounds, it took an awful lot of arguing and fighting and discussion for the church to come up with a doctrine that would overwhelm the Nestorian and get enough people to agree to it. So as silly as it sounds now, once again, we are talking about this stuff today because an awful lot of people believed it and were willing to fight for it once upon a time. So the Nestorians, who more or less got defeated at the Council of Ephesus, didn't go away and didn't really quite change what they thought. They just tried to reclothe it in other words and concepts, which is again why we study this stuff, because they will appear today. People may not necessarily be apologists who can give you history and theology and philosophy, but these ideas still exist, one way or the other. Again, intense political rivalry at play. Again, not sure Eutychus was actually Eutychian, but his followers perhaps designed a doctrine with his name on it, whether he liked it or not. Again, hard to derive precisely the parameters because they're amorphous. Ultimately, the idea is that Jesus only had one nature. And their implication of that was Jesus had a divine nature which absorbed the human nature and became something else. Yes, whatever. In which case, Jesus was really neither fully God nor fully man. Not sure what he was, but he was neither of the two. And as we said, that violates Hebrews and many other verses. So they were still trying, even after they lost. They still came back trying to tweak things. All right. Similarly, would be monothelitism. What does that mean? Mono means one. Thelemata means will. And now, slow down on this one a minute. They're saying Jesus only had one will, and we're saying no, he had two. He had two wills, two minds, two souls. That is being fully God and fully human at once. To have a fully God mind, a fully God will, and a fully God soul, and a fully human mind, human will, and human soul. That's what we believe. That's the implications of what we're saying here. And if that's hard to get your mind wrapped around, yes. When I first read this, I was like, well, of course he had one will. Well, no. Two minds, two centers of consciousness, kind of hard to grasp. But we also say this is how he was at once omniscient and not. He did not have one mind that somehow got partitioned. He had two, one of which got walled off some kind of way we don't understand, which was the divine, and then the human, which was just like ours, only better. So let's go spend some time. How much do we have? We have time. All right. What happened when Jesus' divine and human nature and will and consciousness conflicted? What was that like for him?
Well, if he tells us to bring every thought captive to the obedience of Christ.
He prayed, he sweated blood.
Yeah, but he was able to his sweet,
To tame them.
godly nature, or nature of God, right? So it came out. And I just wanted, I'm sorry, I won't say anything else, but I just wanted to say, when I said all that about peace, is Jehovah's Witnesses will tell you that there will be no peace until some future time.
Okay.
When the end of the world as they foresee it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I went off on the big thing. We have peace now through Jesus.
Amen. So first question, did Jesus' lack of original sin reduce his divine and human inner conflict? Because we know, and we're going to study in a minute, there is no question that the divine and the human conflict. The Bible tells us that directly. The flesh and the spirit are at war. Which means the answer to our question, did Jesus have conflict in himself, is absolutely. If he had a human nature, and he did, and if his human nature was like ours, and it was, there was conflict. There's no way around it. Answer that question.
When it says something right that he experienced every temptation.
Correct.
Or I forget the verbiage.
Hebrews again.
Okay.
So, let's talk about our conflict, and let's try to understand if Jesus' was the same, or how it was different. The paradigm verses for that are Romans 7, 14 through 25. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. For what I am doing, I do not understand, for I am not practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. But if I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing the law is good. So question, was Jesus sold into bondage to sin? Yes.
But it says, he who knew no sin was counted as sin. So he knew no sin. He was counted as sin, that he could, take our place. And then it also says that we have a high priest who was tempted at every point, like as we are, yet without sin.
That really kind of nails it down. Was he sold into bondage to sin?
What does that mean?
Good question. That's what we have to work on. I believe the answer will be he was not sold into bondage to sin at birth because he did not have a sin nature like we do. Not exactly the original sin. I think he was sold into bondage to sin at the crucifix. Now, we would have to do a very long, extensive word study on what that means precisely, so I didn't do that.
You just threw it up there to
I just threw it up there to see if y'all could come up with something because, I reached my limit on some of this stuff, so here you go. I say no sold in bondage to sin because no original sin. Did he do things he didn't want or not do what he wanted? Because it says it right here. I'm not practicing what I like to do, but I'm doing the very thing I hate. That's us. That's us. That's humanity. Paul has just described all of humanity, especially Christians, who actually believe that there is a divine will that they ought to be in conformity with. and know that they're not.
Well, it says that he knew no sin, so you would interpret that to mean he did not sin throughout his human life.
Absolutely.
Through crucifixion. So I would go then that he was not only conflicted between the spirit and the flesh, like humans, but I would also, again, kind of go back to that comment I made earlier about even with the temptation with the devil, and at other points even up into the garden, the idea of knowing he was fully God and fully man, and whether or not he used that power. So it was a conflict of saying, do I act like Satan is encouraging me to do, or do I act like a human?
Amen. And that's really the answer. My question to y'all is this: do y'all think Jesus ever did anything he didn't feel like doing? Do you think
he didn't want to die?
That's right. Did he not say, Father, pass this cup from my lips? Nevertheless, not my will but yours. We're going to get to that verse.
Well, the feeling was human.
Amen. And there must have been a part of him that was saying, I don't want to do this. But he did it anyway.
Wasn't that the plan, like when Karen was talking about when he sweat great drops of blood in the garden? Wasn't the plan for him to be able to feel what we felt and go through what we went through? Otherwise he wouldn't have been tempted in all points.
That is exactly right. So the answer is, did he do things he didn't want or not do what he wanted? Yes. Probably all the time. Probably more than we do. Because sometimes we're a little too unified in our not doing God's will. Sometimes it's a little too easy. Like, oh, I feel like doing this way, and I'm happy about that, even though I shouldn't be. He probably had more conflict than we do in some ways. He had the peace of God that passes understanding, but then he had a human nature that was constantly in conflict with what he knew he was supposed to be doing.
One of the metaphors I think about a lot is we talk about is, I think maybe C.S. Lewis talked about this in Mere Christianity, but the difference between fear and cowardice, and that fear on the battlefield is natural and everybody feels it, but pressing forward even in fear that's what you do when you're persevering. Whereas cowardice is giving into fear, turning the other way, those types of things. And so there's a difference between experiencing what everyone experiences and sort of has a choice to do, and then pressing on with that.
Well said. So yes, he could do things he didn't want to do or not do things he wanted to do, because that would have been the human conflicting with the divine, but he never sinned. So if he didn't feel like doing something and did it anyway, it's because it was the right thing to do, and vice versa. So he never sinned. He had the conflict though. Continue. Now no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. If I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. Did sin dwell in Jesus? He was without sin. Let me reaffirm that. He never committed a sin, but did sin dwell in him?
Temptation?
And we know for a fact, again, at the crucifixion, he became sin. It didn't just dwell in him. He became sin. Before that, did sin dwell in him? Did nothing good dwell in Jesus while he was here? That can't be right. It's not true that sin dwelling in him did anything. Not true that the good he wanted to do, he didn't, and the evil he didn't want to do, he did. But we've already answered that. He always did what was right, even if he didn't feel like it. But is it fair to say nothing good dwells in him or dwelt in him? So hermeneutic moment. Stop for a moment and think of that. Is it true that nothing good dwells in us? Is that true?
Well, the Holy Spirit always dwells in us.
Yeah, rock on. Yeah.
There's that. God made us in his image. In the garden, well, it says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God's image is good, right? And even though we have done everything we can to corrupt it, there is still some of that in us. When God was done, he said it is good every day, and at the end he said it is very good. That includes us, because we were there. After he made us, he said it is very good. God saw all that he made, and it was very good. So is the Bible wrong? Is Paul wrong when he says there's nothing good that dwells in us?
Maybe he's just being pessimistic.
He clarified in his flesh.
Yeah, and that's correct. He was speaking in a way hyperbolically, but really what he's talking about, there's nothing good that dwells in the corrupted aspect of us that's not the divine. But what is in us that is divine is very good, because it's God. Frankly, it is.
I mean, he says that specifically, right after that, he says, nothing good lives in me, comma, that is in my sinful nature. I mean, he didn't put a period after
Right.
that.
Amen. Yeah, read those dots and those commas, they matter. All right then. So, but then we're coming back to Jesus. So then, did nothing good dwell in him? In the flesh? I guess in the flesh. He had the same fleshly nature, so there was a part of him that was not good. What do you do with that? He had to be made like us. So these verses, frankly, and I could do years more study, but frankly, they have to apply to him in some way.
Because he struggled.
Because he struggled. Because he had his human nature. He never sinned. He was always perfect. But a lot of this description that applies to us applied to him too. All right, this is where I was talking about. I see a different law in the members of my body waging war. That's why we know Jesus had a war going on in him, and it was worse than ours. Because he had the perfect divine in him at all times, and talk about the reaction that must have had, the flesh against the spirit in him. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other with my flesh the law of sin. Now, Jesus never served the law of sin. He fought the law of sin. He overcame the law of sin. He struggled with it, but he never fell. That's the difference. But if we answer to any of these questions that it's not exactly for him like it is for us, are we saying he's not exactly human like us? And is that where some of these folks are coming up with these doctrines and these isms? Because maybe with good intention they're saying, okay, but he couldn't have been exactly like us because he never fell to the law of sin like we did. I think we've answered it. Conflict. I don't know that this is going to give us a different answer, but it's good to know where the Bible says is. And he went a little beyond them, this being Jesus, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. That's conflict. That's him saying, really would rather not do this, because he already knew what it was going to be like. So there were two people, two ideas in Jesus that were conflicting. And Jesus said, I would like for you to resolve it this way, God, but I'll accept how you choose to resolve it. And he already knew how God chose to resolve it. He already knew. Was Christ conflicted? Absolutely. Did his will conflict with God's here? Probably not. He had a desire, but he took every thought captive to himself, to his divine nature. What do we see as a prayer model here? Is there anything better you can ever pray than, God, this is what I would like, but you're God and I'm not. So we're going to go with what you like. I'm just letting you know what you already know. I'm just making myself feel better by saying the things that you already knew before there was time. That's how we improve our relationship. But I submit to you ultimately. I will do whatever you say. That's a perfect prayer model. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Who's in conflict here? The Father has turned away from the human Jesus. But we don't believe he turned away from the divine, wherever the divine was, however it was connected. The Father and the human Son have been separated. In the days of his flesh, this is Jesus again, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. This doesn't say Jesus was in conflict, but I can't imagine loud crying and tears and petitions otherwise. Where do those come from? They come from pain and suffering and sorrow and conflict. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, now watch that phrase, guys. Y'all understand why people come back sometimes and say Jesus wasn't fully divine? Because he learned things and he was made perfect. He became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Again, we come up with the answer. The answer is his human flesh and human nature was put into obedience and made perfect and learning. It says he grew in wisdom and favor and stature with God and men. His divine was always perfect and never changed one iota. But Jesus had to be made like his brethren, so logic dictates, even if the verses don't tell us kind of directly, logic tells us, of course, he had inner conflict. But never in a way that compromised or resulted in sin. All right, so philosophy break, a.k.a. open-ended questions with no real answers, which in my opinion is the definition of philosophy. Open-ended questions with no... We've touched on some of these before. How much was Jesus like Adam? We say pretty darn similar.
Probably God's creation.
Yeah, Jesus was the second Adam. Adam was the first Adam. Jesus was the second. Well, how much was Adam like Jesus? And if you think I'm asking the same question, that's kind of my question. Is that the same? To say Jesus was like Adam is the same thing as saying Adam was like Jesus, or is there a difference? A logic puzzle for you.
They were made perfect.
We'll get there in a minute. Well, one difference was, someone just said, Jesus actually had a human mother and a Holy Spirit father. Adam had no human parents. He was just created out of the dust, and God breathed the ruach, the Hebrew for spirit or breath. Just like pneuma or pneuma, depending on who you ask, is Greek for the same thing. My question is this. If Adam hadn't sinned, how different would he have been from Jesus? If Adam had said, I'm not going there, I'm not doing this, how different would he and Jesus have been at that point?
Well, he still wasn't God, though. Adam wasn't God.
There's always a first time to sin.
We say about Jesus that he was the perfect hypostasis, the perfect being, perfect connection between God and man. Was Adam that before the fall? Some say yes, some say no. You got to think about it for a minute, though. He was fully human. He had the divine in him, and he hadn't sinned before the fall. How different was he from Jesus?
Now, why are you saying Adam had the divine in him?
Because he was made in God's image, just like all of us.
But it's still different because he was a creation.
And he was still under the authority of God. I mean, God had said, don't eat of the tree, fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. He would have never had to say that to Jesus, because Jesus was God.
And although, I guess the summary is, although there are more similarities between us and God than we realize sometimes, there are insurmountable differences. We are not God. We will never be God. We may be a pale and small reflection of God in ways that he chooses to make us, but we are never going to be God. Did the divine nature reside in Adam like in Jesus? No. But are humans and divine really so incompatible? Remember, this is the question that is so hard for folks. At the beginning of this little module, we said this is like a first order question. How does the fully divine and the fully human reside in one being? Question is, are they really that different in us? We're not. Yes. I think we have a much smaller connection, obviously, than Jesus did. All right. Some people say the reason why God made us in his image in the first place was because he knew the incarnation was coming and he wanted to prepare us to receive him. Before there was time, he planned that. Remember, though, and the reason why I asked you, is it different to say was Jesus like Adam is the same as was Adam like Jesus? Some people answer this by saying that, remember that a human did not become God. God became a human. Known by general experience, called empirical. The superior can condescend to the inferior much easier than the inferior can raise up to the superior. Why can't we understand this? Because we can't understand God. But for God, him lowering himself to be like us is nowhere near as difficult as us raising up to be like him. So maybe that's not the same question up there. We can imitate animals much better than they can imitate us. Some of